Well, welcome back, everyone. So here's what I thought we would do today. Do a little bit of reflection of the conversation for last week, and then I adjusted the schedule so we will finish the rest of chapter 12 so we can carry on with 13 next week. All right. All right. So first and foremost, I want to hear your all's reflection about our conversations with Rabbi Elisha last week. Any thoughts or reflections or cool things you learned? What says you?
Come on. I had so many.
Mhm.
Not regarding Passover,
Okay.
regarding Judaism, maybe as it is today. I had always considered Judaism to be very static, ritualistic, rooted in the past. And her talk about being able to hold multiple truths, to make your own commentary. I mean, I copied these down on a Sunday night, to make your own commentary. And some of the other things, as well as her mention of needing a loving and caring God, and perhaps the influence of Christianity on her thinking with that. And one thing did stand out for me, though, when she did the closing prayer. She needed a moment's reflection, which was fine. You get centered, whatever. But it made me wonder, do Jews offer free thinking prayer, like when, we do it from our consciousness? Because there was no opening of any kind, and the closure was amen, which we understand. But I really ended up curious about their comfort level with prayer, like we're so used to. So that was a lot. Sorry.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, one kind of, in listening to some of your comments and things, Rabbi Elisha comes from like a particular branch of modern Judaism. So the Shir Tikva is part of the Reformed tradition in Judaism, which puts them on the more liberal end of things. Notably, Rabbi Elisha is around my age and a woman, which is not accepted in all branches of Judaism. I think she even made a comment that like some people don't consider her a rabbi, although she is ordained as a rabbi. So that the Reformed tradition of Judaism does do things differently than I think it's not the like Fiddler on the Roof kind style, which means they have picked up different practices. I've seen Reformed synagogues who bring in guitars and drums and do some of their singing in a much more contemporary way. And so my sense is that yes, Rabbi Elisha is very comfortable with the extemporaneous prayers. It's not necessarily the like in the Jewish tradition, there are a lot of there's this prayer for this thing and this prayer for this thing that are more set down as like this is a traditional prayer. But I mean, our tradition has some of those too. And certain parts of Christianity hold more to those than the Presbyterians do. I remember working in a Catholic hospital as a chaplain, and I was way in over my head because sometimes people wanted me to say certain prayers and I didn't know them. And so then I would send one of the priests their direction because, I mean, similarly, I mean, many traditions kind of oscillate between praying just what's on your mind versus praying in a way that like here are the words to say. So I just want to give a heads up. I did give her a fair warning that I was going to ask her to do this, so I didn't catch her off guard. So I gave her time to prep if she wanted to prep something. So since she chose to pray just what was on her thoughts and mind off the top of her head, that tells me that she did it in the way that she was comfortable with. So
I remember that when I was a hospice volunteer and visiting sort of a Catholic nursing home, and the woman there wanted me to recite with her several of their prayers that they had. And of course, I didn't know them. So she had something for me to read along with her. And she had it all memorized, and she was about 98 years old and still could remember all this stuff. But it was interesting that they have these set prayers, and I knew that they did, but I never was a Catholic, so I never knew them. It was interesting though to listen to them. And I visited a lot of the nuns there, and they were mostly nuns, some were not, but they were interesting the way they looked at their faith.
So any other thoughts on the conversation last week?
Well, I could see why you were friends.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely delightful. And I thought it was helpful in looking at Exodus, and the questions we were asking about God, and she getting all, why is God doing that? And she says, well, we have to look at this perhaps as, well, not metaphor, not necessarily reality. I don't know what word she used, but which is, I think, pretty typical of Reformed Jews anyway. So, but when Rabbi Arnie was there, and you know, they were in our church, they rented space in our church for quite a while. I think he moved more to the more liberal, I think, while he was there, it seemed to me, and they became part of a spiritual group. And I thought, I'm not sure if that church still does that. It's, I don't know, but it was a different.
I know Ed Chezik, which is a very prominent member who does a lot of events with TIG, he, I believe, is studying with Rabbi Arnie with some of the more like mystic end of things.
That's what I mean, yeah, not spiritualistic,
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of interesting. Because I associate that with the Middle Ages in Judaism.
Yeah. So Gary, I saw your hand. What was your thinking?
Well, it's pretty fundamental compared to what you're talking about, but what made impression on me is the number of comments that led you to believe that if you were going to be a participant in a faith, you had to question. You had to question, and that was one of the main requirements of being part of the group. And I thought that was pretty. That made me think in new directions.
Okay. Yeah.
And I thought, in particular, we had a big issue with our God being so horrible to the Egyptians with these terrible plagues. And I don't know whether Rabbi said it or just my mind was running around, but for those that are having difficulty with our God having that type of a history, that you might consider the possibility that the people actually wrote those plagues and created them to from their imagination, the worst catastrophes they could think of. And in that way, when the story was told throughout the ages, it would establish God as most powerful and not challenged. So that was kind of, but I don't know if others got that, or I was just in my own world.
I wasn't really thinking of their guy and our guy, but I thought she made the point that they passing down the history to the children. They wanted to have the story be something that would be remembered. And so there are parts of that in the Passover Seder in the words, but I don't know if they made it up or not, but they certainly maybe highlighted some of the things that were very interesting. And I thought she also said very quietly towards the end, and look what happened to us in the Second World War. Yeah, but of course that's now, and that was then. But the Jews have been persecuted forever, and they're still around. And the resilience, I think, is amazing. And I would like to know more about what has made the Jewish community so resilient despite all the killing and the everything, this thing everything that's gone on, and the resilience is still there. I can't get that from my Jewish friends. I don't think does it. Mostly I don't think about it. So, but to be able to survive that kind of history, I don't think, except maybe the gypsies and the Armenians, that kind of persecution has been extraordinary.
Yeah.
Well,
It was before they killed Jesus.
Yeah. So Mary Ellen and then Helen, because I know Mary Ellen's been trying to jump in.
Yeah, I would. I'd like to go back to what Gary said.
Okay.
Because I totally agree with what he's saying, and it's bringing to mind what Rabbi Alicia said about there being multiple truths.
Right.
Yes.
And also I wrote down here that she said not taking stories literally, but as teach a lesson, and always questioning, and I really locked in on the multiple truths idea. And the bottom line of this is my respect for their whole tradition with this kind of an attitude has just blossomed. I really related to what she was saying about this.
Yeah. So Helen, what were you going to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say I also agree with Gary in that the culture then was extremely different than ours, and somehow or other these stories, I think, help them to understand the power of God, just as you mentioned, Gary. I think that it's their culture had a great deal to do with it. Sometimes these terrible things that they say God did kind of went along with the way that they were able to keep their group together. But not that they would want to do these things, but on the other hand, it's their culture.
Yeah. So one thing that came to mind in both last weekend, Gary, when you brought it up, of like people writing down like the scariest things they could imagine as part of the story of like what would scare the socks off of someone. And I've seen some interesting discussions of how looking at horror films actually helps people understand culture. Because if you look at what horror films are produced at like any one point in time, you see what society is afraid of. Because the difference of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is very much a like Red Scare allegory, versus some like what's being produced today. It's like, what are people afraid of? And what does that say as a people when like, what does your imagination come up with? And this is in some ways walking a very fine line there too, of how do we looking at how they understood the world and what they would think is scary and what they think looks powerful. Yeah, Larry, what's going on?
Well, and we're saying what we think people thought of and what we think, but look what the church did. Look at the Spanish Inquisition. Look at the torturing that the church, I mean, that's fact. That's known. You don't have to say, well, we thought they did that. They did do it.
Oh,
The-
yeah.
And they
Yeah.
were, the church itself was doing terrible things. No wonder they've got a God that does terrible things.
Well, and the Protestants did a lot of burning people at the stake also.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's
Right.
wicked and so forth.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's humans will human, and they use a lot of the things that are in culture to make excuses for why we do terrible things. And yeah, it's always uncomfortable, but like acknowledging the things that have been done basically on our behalf, whether it's, yeah, the Spanish Inquisition or our own tradition. I mean, I know Presbyterians don't hold on to John Calvin very tightly, but we do come out of his kind of like line of thinking. And yeah, John Calvin personally wrote the signature to burn someone at the stake. The Unitarian. He was a Unitarian, and John Calvin did not like him, and he got burned because of it. So it's one of those things of, I think, holding many things at the same time. It's a kind of holding multiple truths is not an easy thing to do, but I hope it was kind of, if nothing else, permission giving. If you find that kind of dissonance where it's like, it feels like multiple contradictory things feels true, or not feeling guilty if, yeah, you have questions, or yeah, you disagree. Like seeing how some other faiths like make room for that. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can take some of their wisdom as they took from, or like, the wisdom is always an exchange. And so if I hope some of that was beneficial even for our own wrestlings and understandings. All right, so any final thoughts? Any lingering things that you remember stood out that you want to just highlight real quick?
Invited us to, I thought, a
Passover.
Passover.
Yes.
But a Passover is held within individual homes, or is there a church service that, or a service in the temple that goes along with it?
I'm going to have to check on the details. What I've often seen is that, yes, Passover Seders are done at the home, but there is a corporate one that is also done.
Hmm.
I am not sure about this, but I will get the details. I actually was planning something out. It's, excuse me, next year it'll be at the end of April. So it's a ways away at this point, but I will make sure that we're in contact and I find out all the details so that when it comes around that you all are invited.
Nice.
And we
Yeah.
don't have to circumcise.
Well,
hope
the
not.
thing is, with American culture, we actually, most of our men are anyways, so.
Yeah, I know.
At any rate,
They don't do that to women, of course. But I thought that was interesting, that if you had a visitor, they could participate in Passover if they got circumcised.
so that's actually a good transition. Let's actually go to the text for today. We're doing the second half of the institution of Passover today. Actually, before that, I just wanted to say, because I was talking with Rabbi Alicia after we hung up the call just to make sure, or to hear what she thought and everything. She absolutely loved talking with you all, and her comment is, let's do this again. This will be a part of one of her sermons, and so this hopefully has kind of renewed renewed spark in the relationship between our congregation and theirs. So she was really excited about this whole conversation. So just know that it seemed like you all really enjoyed the conversation. Just know that she did too. So yeah, Larry?
Passover, the Seder seems like such a ritualistic sort of thing that they do repeatedly year after year after year after year after year. And I'd be curious, what does that mean to them?
Mhm.
It seems to
One
be.
thing to do, yeah.
So the question, I mean, without getting too far into it, churches often do Christmas Eve pageant year after year after year.
Yeah.
And like we walk through Holy Week every year, and we say, and so there's, while we don't necessarily have the same script, I'm sorry if I sent a link out to one
Mhm.
script. It seemed like the link didn't work for some people. I double checked it, and it was good on my end, so I don't know what happened.
Yeah, mine worked, and I didn't read the whole thing because
It's long.
I tried to look at it 10 minutes before we started.
I looked at
But it was very
Repeated itself
important.
Mhm. Oh,
so much that I kind of got lost, but
Yeah.
yes,
was
it is repetitive. As scripture is repetitive, it but it's one of those things that it's always interesting to me that when you encounter something new and different, you can see all these details, and then you realize that, oh, that's actually in our tradition. I'm just familiar with our version of it. And because religions often have similar pieces, and so we do Christmas pageants all the time. We do Easter, Holy Week. We repeat the same story over and over again. So maybe think of why we do that, and then we can save that question for the next time we get to hang out with either Rabbi Elisha or join her at Shir Tikva. But let's go to the scripture, because I don't want us to not have time to actually finish this chapter. All right. So 2 weeks ago, we left off at verse 20. Verse 20 was the end of the institution of Passover. So like the God telling the people how you're going to celebrate this in years to come. That is often, or parts of it are influenced by temple worship, and we saw pieces of this. Now, verse 21, we are jumping back into the story itself and why some of these pieces are being celebrated. We're going to see what the people are actually doing. So in verse 21, Moses calls the elders of Israel together, and then we get the actual instructions of what they are to do for putting the blood on the door for the actual passing of the Spirit of God. So slaughter a lamb, take a bunch of hyssop, hyssop is the bitter herb. Notably, drawing some parallels, that is why they eat parsley today. Parsley is a European root. If you remember, Rabbi Elisha says they use different ones. The hyssop is kind of the Middle Eastern parallel. So take the hyssop and mark the door frames with blood, and no one should go outside. So how does that kind of compare with the institution side of it, where it's like roast a lamb, make sure everyone has like a lamb per household? This one is just saying, like, mark the door with blood.
What was the question?
I don't know.
So that's to make sure that God doesn't mistake the Jewish families with
Mm-hmm.
the Egyptians.
Yeah. Yep. For when he sees the blood on the lintel, on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door and will not allow the destroyer to enter the household and strike you down. So this is very much going with that, the conception of God, of like, God is literally like going through the streets. I don't know about you all, but for me, it feels less like that omnipresent God and more of the like walking down the streets and kind of going through the city kind of a thing. And so carrying on, there's once again the repetition of you shall carry this on as a perpetual ordinance. And there's once again the promise of like, you're going to observe this when you go into the land that God has promised you. So that there is like the reaffirmation of the covenant, the last piece of it. We have blessings, we have children. Now this is in progress of getting the land that God has promised, and this is a piece of that. So you are going to celebrate the Passover when you have the final piece of the covenant.
And the children will know, they will ask what it's about, and then they will be told. They're passing it on.
Mm-hmm. So right here, we already see how the focus is on the children. Make sure that the children know.
Right.
So are there other things that, like in our own lives that we see this kind of emphasis of the like, we need to do this thing so the youngest among us know our tradition? Like, what are some of the things we heard Rabbi Elisha talk about, like how the modern Passover is geared towards telling children. What in our own culture do we make sure to tell the children? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I'm thinking about Easter and
Okay.
waving the palm fronds that so many churches pass out, small pieces of palms, whatever, to remember that triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And I don't know whether the Easter egg hunts falls into this or not, because that's so secular, but there are things that we do repeatedly at Christmas. We sing the same carols that we've loved so much since childhood. That's a tradition that there, O Little Town of Bethlehem, that, there are just songs that go with the holiday, that what we're celebrating. And I think we're bringing our children up in the tradition with a lot of that repetitive singing, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a certain segment of the population chooses to ban books. So children don't learn what we don't want them.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it goes after the children.
Yeah.
Well, we do have classes sometimes. Most churches have classes before the young people learn the traditions of the church and some of the things that we study. So they know about communion and they know about the different parts of the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the breakdowns, it's interesting that we're seeing in, I think, the mainline denominations, like most of your and actually we're seeing this kind of across the board in a lot of different areas, but we currently have a very big disconnect with the older parts of the church and the younger parts of the church. That one thing that we're seeing is that young people can be like, go through Sunday school and they learn the lessons of the church and they learn it. I've heard a lot of people say like, oh yeah, I learned what Jesus said. It just, to me, the church didn't practice what Jesus said. And I actually like what Jesus said, but the church isn't where I live it out. So there seems to be that fracture, but the other part we're seeing a bit of an interesting fracture is, and we're dealing with this actually at session right now, because we have a lot of people on our membership rolls that haven't been here in years. And so the question is always, how do you deal with people who kind of have just drifted away and never told us that they wanted to leave the church, but they're not coming back? And one of the things is we send kids through Sunday school, we put them through confirmation, then they go to college and move away. And so it's interesting that our model of church still very much hinges on tell the children our practices. but there's something about our modern life that seems like the telling the children hasn't actually made that perpetual observance that we kind of see instituted here, and that we heard Rabbi Elisha talked about. Our perpetual observances seem to have a fracture in them.
Yeah.
No, I'm not, I was gonna ask you a question about what Session's doing, but then I don't want to redirect this conversation.
They're just creating a plan at this moment to reach out to people to see, basically, like, hey, we haven't seen you in a while. Do you still want to be involved? If not, let us know, and kind of creating a plan to get our actual size of our congregation. So they're just creating a plan, and we're trying to do it compassionately, and that's the key point, is how do you do that with compassion? So so yeah, it's something interesting to think about in our own lives, is like, there seems to be the hope of a perpetual observance, even if it's not Passover. We have our own kind of perpetual observances, and how do we continue that? And do we have to change how we do that for it to be that perpetual observance?
Mm.
So in verse 28, it says the Israelites went and did just as the Lord commanded Aaron and Moses. So they went out and they did the things. So then we kind of switch views to the time of midnight, where the Lord is actually going around and striking down all the firstborns in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeons, and the firstborn of the livestock. I did double check it. It seemed to indicate that, unlike my original assertion, the firstborn, you're no longer a child you are no longer considered a firstborn if you're the patriarch yourself. So this is mainly talking about younger folk.
Ah, okay.
So clarification there. You have a change in status once you're the head of the household. So
No.
Well, what does that mean, that they dedicate that the firstborn belongs to God? I don't know what that means in practice. But
first, the firstborn belongs to God. This is clarified in I believe Leviticus. I would have to check my other, or I would have to do a little bit of looking into. Basically, that as a deity, you get to set what your tribute's going to be. I mean, different deities throughout the ancient world required different kinds of sacrifices. They wanted different offerings, and so each temple had its own thing. The God that we have before us has claimed the firstborn. The firstborn of...
Yeah. Does it mean that the firstborn child is sacrificed?
Yes and no. So this goes to Abraham and Isaac, that yes, God has claimed the firstborn, but instead of doing child sacrifice, which God does not want you to do, you basically do a double duty sacrifice on behalf of your firstborn. So if there's one sacrifice to give thanks for a baby boy, there's a smaller sacrifice for a baby girl, but the firstborn has a bigger sacrifice, and then every subsequent child is not as much.
But that's a male.
A lamb instead?
Hold on. Sue, finish your question, then Mary Ellen, you had another one. Sue, what was your question?
I still don't understand. Does that mean that the firstborn, they sacrifice an animal instead of the...
Yes.
Okay.
I was just clarifying that that's for the firstborn male. If the firstborn is a girl, I'm assuming they don't do all that. They wait for the firstborn male to happen.
Yeah, I need to double check. I tried to do a quick Google just to see if I could get the Bible verse, and it was not helpful.
Well, if they're sacrificing the firstborn males in this plague, wouldn't they celebrate the firstborn male with the big celebration? But not if the firstborn's a girl, that, you said they have a smaller celebration for the girls. I thought I was clarifying that the firstborn big celebration was when the firstborn was a male.
I believe so.
Well, on chapter 13, or chapter 13, verse 13, it says, every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when
Hey, there you go. Thank you,
your
Helen.
son asks you. So I think it would be the male.
Yes.
Or donkey.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. With donkeys.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want any donkeys.
Yeah.
Don't redeem it, you must break its neck. What does that mean?
We'll get to that one next time around. Consecration of your firstborn. Okay, I was wrong in where that ordinance was. That's actually in the next chapter. Okay, so we can talk about some of the meaning of the firstborn, but for this chapter, what we need to know is God has claimed the firstborn of human and animal as the proper sacrifice. There is ways that they are going to deal with it, because God actually has already said God doesn't want child sacrifice. That was established back in Genesis. But when push comes to shove, because the Egyptians have not redeemed their firstborns, they are still gods. And so God is actually taking the tribute that God sees as his own, but you also see it as kind of the flip side of what happened at the beginning of Exodus, where the Egyptians were killing Hebrew children. Now God is taking Egyptian children, and animals. All right, so
what is the meaning of sacrificing an animal or a person? What does that do? What does that placate God? What does it mean?
Yes.
What's an offering?
Yeah, it's an offer. So there's like the two sides of it. So one of it is actually a show of faith for the humans involved. So it's one of those, it is a show of trust to give God the first one, to say, like, I trust you to give me more. So on the human side of it, it's thanksgiving and trust. God is not said to actually consume the offerings. It does say at some point that, like, God smells the aromas and is pleased. So there's like a smell element to it. But once a temple is established, so this is for the temple cult that develops in Jerusalem, what functionally happens is the sacrifices go to feed the priests, and it's a way to kind of support the temple complex. Is the sacrifices kind of support the people who are doing all the religious activities, because they can't do other things to support their own livelihood. The Levites don't have land, they don't have property, they don't farm, they don't raise cattle or sheep. So people make sacrifices. The priests get the first cut, and it actually tells you like what the priests can actually take and what they can't take. You get the second, you get the majority of the meat, but the priests get the prime cuts, and that's how you feed your priests for doing the special rituals. So that's how it worked in the temple setting.
Well, it was sacrifice was pretty common in lots of different religions too. The Mexican
Yeah.
sacrificed people.
Mm-hmm. And okay, Mary Ellen, I know you're trying to jump in. What's up?
Well, I'm thinking also from, and I'm struggling with names right now, but when Abraham was gonna sacrifice Isaac, is that right? If I got the names
Yeah.
right? And it was a test from God of his faith. How much did he believe in God? Was he willing to sacrifice his firstborn son, maybe his only son? And to me, I'm looking at this sacrificial business with the firstborns here, or I take that back, sacrifice in general, that you are offering the best you have to God, and sometimes it's all you have, but it's a show of faith, that you are willing to give up this most important thing, to show God the faith you have.
Yeah. Right. I think that that is kind of spot on. I think some of this talk about like sacrifice is strange to us today, if only because in our part of the world, like we give money to the church and like we do that to kind of support, I mean, not dissimilarly, like your all's tithes pay my income so I can do the job of church as my primary job. And so that functions as like the temple system is not dissimilar, but the like I'm literally going to set something on fire and destroy it, we don't really do that. Now it is still practiced in the world. In my gallivanting around India, I toured a temple and I did not realize that the goats that were walking in to the temple were being sacrificed. And so like I actually was like in a sacrificial temple, and my oh my, was I surprised. So it is still practiced in the world, but I think it's a very different worldview because we have a very like cerebral God of our understanding. God is like omniscient, omnipresent. It's different when you have a more locationally based God that may actually be able to interact with the sacrifice a little bit more. I think it's a different mindset because it is meant to be, I think placating is the wrong word, but it is meant to be pleasing.
So, I don't know whether you said it or Alicia said it, but we're talking about the Gospel of John. They are not celebrating Passover because Jesus is the Passover sacrifice, which made my blood run cold, but because that's a human sacrifice.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And that's very standard atonement theology, is that God or Jesus was sacrificed so we aren't sacrificed. So in that, when you think of redemption, like they're about to talk about how do you redeem your firstborn, because the firstborn belongs to God, but God doesn't want you to kill your firstborn. So instead of killing your firstborn, this is how you redeem the price on their head, basically.
Well, that's John's interpretation.
So hear me out though. So that is how you redeem the firstborn. And then the Jesus fan club took that language and said, well, we all have a price on our head because we're sinful people. So Jesus died as the sacrifice to redeem the price on our heads caused by original sin. And yeah, that's very much what the Gospel of John's theology is. Not every Christian tradition goes by that. It's actually one of the very big rifts early in the church between what became the Roman Catholic Church and what became the Orthodox traditions. The Orthodox traditions don't really deal in atonement theology. They're more all about the incarnation and what it means for God to become human. So that's like your Russian Orthodox, your Eastern Orthodox, your Romanian Orthodox, all the ones with Orthodox on the end of it. They really don't deal with atonement theology, but the Roman Catholic Church took it, and then certain Protestant churches really like atonement theology.
Oh.
So that's where we get the sacrifice kind of talk in our own tradition.
Mhm.
I saw a hand fly up somewhere. Did I miss someone? Okay. Let's see. So one of the other ways to look at this, just one more angle before we keep moving on, is every household sacrificed a lamb to paint the door frame. That could also be seen as redeeming the firstborn, because that is protection for the household that God will not strike, but you're also seeing that that an animal is sacrificed for that protection. So it's, you kind of see some of the repetition of some of the same elements of that will come to play, that we'll talk about next time. So any other questions or thoughts about the relationship with God and firstborns and that, or are we good for now? Okay, let's keep moving. So, verse 30, Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his officials and the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry. Basically, everyone woke in the night to find their firstborns dead. He summons Aaron and Moses, even after he says, I never want to see you again. And this is finally where he says, go out, take all of your people, go worship the Lord, take your flocks, your herds, and be gone. But his final comment is, and bring a blessing on me too. So after Pharaoh's gone back and forth with this issue, what do we think of this final response? Leave, take everyone with you, and bless me.
He's being certain he's got all the possibilities covered.
Yeah? Why do you say that?
Well, if the Israelites win, he's asking them to bless him in spite.
Somewhere, I'm looking for it and I can't find it. Somewhere in the commentary, I read that the Pharaoh was afraid that this wasn't the last plague. And, if he's asking for the Lord's blessing, maybe he's asking, and no more, get these people out of here and no more plagues. So,
Yeah, he didn't know if God was going to do 10 plagues. What if it was the 12 plagues? What if it was the 15 plagues? Like, there's we like 10 because we're in a 10-digit system. We kind of like the number 10, but that doesn't mean Pharaoh knew there was only going to be 10 plagues. What if God turned it up to 11?
But what if after he let them go, God wasn't finished with Pharaoh and needed to continue more to make his point? Pharaoh doesn't know what the future holds, so he's, asking for the Lord's, I'm letting your people go, so give me a blessing.
So we see this a little bit further on with the common Egyptians, which is what comes next. The Egyptian people urge them to go quickly, leave us quickly. And there's the little bit of the bread hadn't risen. This wasn't intentional that the bread hadn't risen. It just happenstance it hadn't risen. And so they took their bread and their kneading bowls, but they asked the Egyptians for their gold, their silver, their clothing, their jewelry, as God instructed them to. And so they let them have it because they're like, please bless us. Take this and do something kind. And one of the thoughts is that we have the behind the scenes knowledge that God is killing the firstborns. The Egyptians don't necessarily know the plague is going to stop at the firstborns. What if this is something that spreads? What if the firstborns are just the first and then God's going to keep killing people in the family? They don't know God's plan at this point. Not even Pharaoh knows God's plan. So there is a possibility of leave before we all die. Now people are dying. Go. we don't want to be dead. So there's always a difference between like what the reader knows, what the main character knows, and what the other people in the story know. And the Egyptians, they don't actually know very much. So they are officially sent out, being told to bring Pharaoh a blessing. And I already mentioned it, but with the Egyptians giving the people the gold, the silver, and the jewelry. I believe when we read this at the beginning of Exodus, I told you, put that in your back pocket, because the question is, how are they gonna pull that one off? What do you think? They were told that they were going to plunder the Egyptians, that the Egyptians were just gonna hand over their stuff, and here we see they were scared and they handed over their stuff. Yeah, Gary?
I got kind of hung up on that in that the terms in my Bible are not give. It's
Okay.
and Lent. And which led me to think, well, that is an interesting, again, like you say, put that in your pocket to see eventually how is that justified? Is it, are they repay the Egyptians, or what? Why did I use the word borrowed or lent? An obligation that the Israelites will carry into the future.
Let me look up the Hebrew real quick to see what they're translating. Oh boy, that is a big old word, which is a combination of words. Okay, I see why they have a little bit of leeway in what they were translating. So a very wooden translation is, they granted them what they requested.
Yes, yeah.
So, it seems like whether it was considered a loan or a take this and get out of town, it seems like the Egyptians are doing what the Israelites are saying. Yeah. I would have to spend a little bit more time to break apart that like 4-part word there.
Yeah, like in my Bible, then it says the Egyptians gave them what they wanted. And so they plundered the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
So they're saying, you know, they're fulfilling what God told they were going to plunder, take away everything. Well, yeah, they just asked for it, and the Egyptians gave it to them because they were frightened to death.
So one of the other interesting questions is, did Pharaoh think they were going to come back? Is the assumption that this is still a vacation, or is this a never come back yet?
Never come back.
Yeah.
Never come back.
Because I would argue actually the opposite, that the assumption is they are coming back. Because of what happens next with Pharaoh chasing after them. And we'll get to that. But the question, or just keep that thought kind of lingering around, is what is the assumption? Are they leaving forever? Which is why I'm wondering with what Gary said, Lent, is the assumption actually that the assumption that because the request was always, let us go worship and we will come back. This seems like a get out of town, but is the assumption that they're still gonna, like, your livelihoods here, are you gonna come back? Yeah. What's happening afterwards? Yeah,
well,
Mary.
They said originally they said they were just going for 3 days.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mary Ellen, then Larry.
Well, I'm reading the commentary in the HarperCollins, and it says that counting women, children, and the elderly, the total will exceed 2 million. And I don't see how Pharaoh can expect 2 million people to turn around and come back.
Okay, but Pharaoh says to them, take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too. So if he's asking them to bring a blessing, somebody's coming back, huh?
Now, the word bring is loaded.
Mm-hmm. So
Well,
this
mine
is,
says, oh, excuse me.
oh,
go ahead.
go for it.
Mine just says, and bless me also.
Ah.
So I guess it depends on your translation.
So if the thought was that they're gonna come back in a few days, then the borrow and lend makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Ah, they were just gonna use it, what, for the trip?
Yep. Let's see. Can I get some?
They had to pay resort tax.
Okay, interesting. So the part that tells me that Pharaoh, or Larry, I think you pulled out the two things that created my assumption of Pharaoh is expecting them to come back, partially because he says, as you said.
Yeah.
Pharaoh is honoring what they have been asking for, but they have not been honest with what they've been asking for, or forthright with what they're asking.
Mhm.
So this isn't actually the end, but we'll put a pin in that and we'll come back to that when they actually follow after the group. So yeah, so let's go to them actually like leaving. So the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. Succoth is actually the name of one of the celebrations in September that Rabbi Elisha mentioned. But it basically means booths, but it's referenced here as a city. So they traveled from like basically the capital out. And Larry, you're I think we have the same HarperCollins Bible. So it says 600,000 men, and says with the women, children, and elderly, around 2 million, with about 20,000 soldiers evidently are kind of assumed to be in that mix. What is interesting is the next verse is 38, saying a mixed crowd went up with them, which the wording here implies that it wasn't just the Hebrew people leaving, but they had intermarried with other slaves. And so there is a mixed group. So some of these people are basically married into this group, and they're leaving too. So more than just the Hebrew people are leaving, the Hebrews and the people married in, they're all leaving. They're a mixed group. So this is liberation for more than just the original kind of tribe of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is a mixed group, which is interesting. But them, along with the livestock, and both flocks and herds. So they kind of get out, but then they kind of have this moment of pause where they are baking bread, but they are holding this kind of night vigil. We see this, so verse 40 says that they had lived in Egypt 430 years, and all the companies of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. And that was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So they left in the dead of night. They kind of got out of the city, and it sounds like they paused to bake bread and kind of hold that vigil there. So they're not completely out of the land. They're kind of out of the like main metropolis area, but they're like, seems like they're making camp before they continue on. So, and this is the same night is the vigil to be kept for the Lord throughout the generations. And then we once again kind of got a rephrasing of the institution of Passover. This is now like version number 3 we're getting of how to celebrate the Passover, but these are some additional instructions. Your servants, they're not a part of it necessarily. Foreigners shall not eat it, but as I believe, Sue, you pointed out, if aliens living in the land want to celebrate it, get the men circumcised and then they can. But this is specifically for the people of Israel, for the people who are the people of the covenant, the people of the promise, to remember what happened to them and their ancestors. So what do you think? This kind of like wraps up the institution of Passover. Ooh, we are at 11 o'clock. So any final thoughts? I'm sorry, I thought we had a little bit more time there. Any final thoughts on Passover at the moment?
Can we continue and finish this even though we're overtime?
Yeah, sure. If you all have time, I'm more than happy to run over, or do we want to continue next week?
Let's wrap it up.
Wrap it up?
Let's finish it.
Let's finish it. All right. So what are y'all's final thoughts on kind of how this, we have the 10th plague, we have multiple instructions on how to celebrate it. Do we feel like we have a handle on what Passover is? And kind of where the people are at this moment?
It's really interesting how specific it is about who can't get it, who can't have it. Because they're gonna have Passover and they say, whoops, get some people here who aren't gonna be circumcised. I mean, that seems
I don't know why the Jewish
very
people are
important
so
thing.
fixated on that, but that certainly seems to be a prime importance.
I sometimes think of it as like, are you serious about this? Are you just a passerby who like finds this new little religion and thinks it's cool, so you want to join? Like having that as like your litmus test of are you wanting to join us is actually like shows that you have to be serious if you really want to join us.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
Well, and some say it was also a cleanliness sort of thing, that it was good hygienic practice to have it done.
did they know that then? We
Ah,
don't.
they might well have. Yeah, I would think so. I would think so.
So there's two interesting things, or Mary Ellen, I see your hand just a moment. There's a lot of the rules that are in like Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy that are seen as a health code. And they didn't have modern understandings of germs, and so a lot of this is mitigating what they could understand. But it's actually like some of it's decent health advice. Like they are very fixated on skin conditions at one point to like figure out if your skin condition is contagious or not. But one very fascinating point where you see this in practice is they have records from the Middle Ages, and the Jewish communities were not as affected by the Black Plague because of some of these practices. That they do seem to work. Not as well as our modern health system in certain things, but for the ancient world, a lot of their practices really did keep them healthy. So
Yeah.
They were big on washing too.
yes.
Always want their hands.
Yeah. But Mary Ellen, what are you thinking?
Well, back on verse 45, with no bond or hired servant may eat of it. I think this is the Lord's intention to keep the I'm searching for words, the community pure, and not water down the impact of what they're doing. It's kind of like if you let anybody do this, it loses its significance, its importance, its focus on this Passover that we've just been through, this plague, the redemption from the Lord of your firstborns, and having this memory of how you will observe it. But don't just include anybody in this. This is for us. This is, in recognition of what the Lord I did for you.
Mhm.
So
I
that's
think
what
I think that's a really good point of like sometimes by holding things back from public, you do keep a level of specialness. And we can kind of think about like what are the things that we really do not share with everyone because it is like holy, or we want to keep it special, or I mean,
Yeah.
even as something as silly as we don't roast turkeys throughout the year. You can roast a chicken, you can roast a ham hock, you can roast a lot of things. But as Americans, we kind of reserve the full turkey dinner for one day a year because it keeps it kind of special.
communion.
Mhm.
Communion's another one. I mean, this is a debate back and forth. Do you do it every week? Do you do it every so often? And different traditions slice the cake every different way. Some people say only members can. Some people say anyone who's in the room. But different people have different ways of keeping it special. Yeah.
Well, you have to, basically you have to accept the Lord as your, God and Savior. You have to, that's your entry point into community.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's not something. The strength really is in having people that are committed and not wishy-washy. I mean, you're either pregnant or you're not. You're either in or you're not.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you retain your strength, is by not letting people that are halfway in or just kind of touch by at their convenience.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Right. Now, there is one slightly more cynical take on this, though. Do you know what would be really bad for your own situation in life if you own slaves? Repeat a story about how slaves became free people. Which is the practical matter is if you are not allowing the people that you own to hear the story of the Passover, they are not hearing about how their masters gained their own freedom.
Mhm.
Oh,
Mhm.
Mm.
It
Right.
is why a lot of slave owners in the American South were very cautious about what stories they read to the African American population, because they found that when the slaves did read the story of the Exodus, they got ideas and they acted on them. So
Mhm.
that's the cynical point of view, is don't allow your servants and your hired people to hear this story because they might get ideas.
Mhm. Right.
they weren't allowed to read.
Mhm.
But it's like in the ancient world, this would have been told. So like, you don't even want your servants to hear the story. Don't, or that, like I said, that's the cynical view, is that if you don't give people ideas they don't need. So.
Well, they do have the spirituals that they sang, which was probably was later, do focus on let my people go.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, all right. Any other final thoughts for today, or? All right. Well, let's close with a word of prayer then. Let us pray. Gracious God, I want to give you thanks this morning that you are a God who is okay with us asking questions, with us wrestling with your story, that you do not strike us down or take our firstborn child or the things most dear to us just because we ask questions, but God, that we're able to investigate your stories, that we are able to try to put our heads in the places of our spiritual ancestors who wrestled with some of these questions before us and handed down these stories because they are powerful stories, God. Sometimes we need to investigate them to find the cracks and the the places where the Spirit shines through and talks to us today. So we give you thanks for that. And I give you thanks for this group that is continually willing to wrestle again and again, asking questions and staying longer just to scratch a little deeper beneath the surface. I ask that you bless us, that you help us keep wrestling and keep asking questions, but we do, God, ask that we do find answers or comfort in the dissonance and find you in the mess of it all and in the complexities of our lives, that we do hear you and see your guidance. So I ask that you bless this group until we're able to gather again together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
all.
you.
See you all next week.
Right,
No.
thanks.